Look, thank you very much. I'm Richard Stobo, and this talk that I'm about to give has been evolving by the minute through the course of the day, partly because I was a bit uncertain about the audience. I wasn't quite sure. I know a class. I can talk to a class without a problem. But I thought, look, how much assumed knowledge is there in the room? And there's a lot. I don't need to go through the Australian core stuff very much, but it segues very neatly from Mel's talk just then about the 100 days. It was a nice point to finish. I've been teaching for a long time, and I started teaching history at a big independent boys' school. So if you want to talk, and military history is a part of the place. It's like walking through a museum in many ways for the plaques and the windows in the chapel and all this sort of thing. But when I started teaching World War I many years ago, Gallipoli was 5 pages of the textbook. The Western Front was paragraph at the end, and then they won. Monash should probably get a mention. Over the last 25 years, it's grown. So Gallipoli is probably still 5 pages, but now the Western Front gets a little more from Mel. You all know the story. Hummel, of course, Monash's masterpiece. But it was the thing that intrigued me as to what happened on the Western Front, and in particular those last 100 days, because we just don't spend enough time on it. And I was chatting with Aaron a little while ago about the War Memorial, and it's sort of the space it's given to the 100 days, and it has increased over time, but still in comparison to Gallipoli, as we all know, it's very much a poor cousin. So I did an honours degree many years ago on nationalism in Australia, and looked at the very convoluted nature of Australian nationalism. So these things all sort of intersect. It comes back to Peter's point about looking before the war, I think, for an understanding of the war. And I arrived at the conclusion, this was just before the bicentenary actually, that Australian nationalism was a combination of parochialism, of an Australianness, a sense of Australianness, but also this very deep-seated sense of Britishness. And we can't underestimate the parochial side of things. So the Victorians didn't like the New South Welshmen. New South Welshmen didn't like the Victorians, hated the Victorians. My father never said you never trust a Victorian, he was much older. But that plays out a little bit in the way in which our war history, we sort of overlooked that, I should say, in our war history. We tend to think of the Australians as this amorphous mass, and of course we weren't. You had people fighting, Western Australians were fighting with New South Welshmen in the 1 battalion. They're 4,000 kilometres apart. Yeah, they speak a common language and they share a lot of cultural identity, but they are very different in many respects too, and they're very parochial. Anyhow, look, that's just as a little preamble. I started to look at the logistics of the Australian Corps, but then it took me about 4 seconds to work out that was going to just drive me mad, and as a result of that, I then had to play into the operational side of things. But I didn't want to just trot out Bean for the 400th time in a narrative. So as a result of that, I ended up. It occurred to me fairly quickly, although it grew into a major work, that if we're going to look at the Australians and we're going to discuss their fighting capacity in the final 100 days, we need to compare them to something, and the Third Corps was just a very obvious comparison. The Third Corps, British Third Corps, sit right alongside them for virtually that entire period. There are a lot of similarities. There are also some significant differences between the two. But I will say that the similarities, I think, outweigh the differences. But we will discuss that. Monash, we all know, of course. Richard Butler on the right. He was the commander of Third Corps for a period of time. He's one of Haig's acolytes. He was cavalryman. He was on Haig's staff for a long time before he was given Corps command. He was not the best Corps commander in the world. He actually doesn't go missing in action, but he leaves the battlefield on the 9th of August, 10th, 11th of August 1918, due to a pre-arranged leave. But it's a bad look, because when he leaves, he'd been sick. When he leaves and goes back to England for medical recovery, Monash is being knighted he's not being knighted in the field, he's already been knighted. He's having the knighthood bestowed upon him in the field. And of course, if you want to draw comparisons between the Australian experience at Amiens and the British experience of Amiens, you need only look at that and you see that the Australians had something to boast about. But I do draw your attention to the dress. Doesn't have a Sam Brown on, Richard Butler, but he's certainly, the two, you could put Monash into that, they look rather similar, I think, as did all of the Canadian commanders, I must say, a minute ago. Okay, there's the Australian advance. I was going to talk about the Australian advance, but I don't think I really need to. I'd rather talk about the Third Corps advance. I'm not doing a 50-50 comparison. I am drawing on Third Corps as I need to. So I'm not going to pretend that it's even. Third Corps operated to the north of the Australians. They attacked on the 8th of August, as did the Australians and the Canadians. The Australians were ropeable. Third Corps didn't capture Chipilly Spur. Many of you will know this story, I'm sure. And they blamed the Third Corps for all the problems that were happening on the left flank of the Australian front. Third Corps had a very, very difficult task on the 8th of August, often overlooked. Third Corps was attacking in really difficult terrain given to them by the Australians in a really poor state. They were attacking across the along the Morlancourt Ridge, again familiar to many of you who've been there, I'm sure. Very narrow ridge, comparatively narrow ridge. The Australians are attacking across this huge open plain of the Santerre, the big farmland south of the Somme River, where tanks can operate. They've got wonderful firepower behind them. Just before they moved to the Santerre, if you weren't familiar with this, the Australians cross over to the Somme, but just before that, on the 29th of July, a little anniversary that's just passed us, there's a final raid at Morlancourt, and they capture trenches above Morlancourt, then leave those trenches and head across the Somme to get ready for the attack on the 8th of August. Third Corps have to move into those trenches. Those trenches are muddied. They're very, very poorly constructed. They're a maze. They're a real rabbit warren. They're very difficult. They're in a vulnerable position. And the Germans want them back. And so when the Third Corps move into these trenches, they're suddenly confronted by a very difficult situation. Now, the Australians go over, prepare against a weakened enemy. The Germans bring down the 27th Württemberg Division to get the trenches back. They're sick of the Australian raids. And so when they come down, they are fresh. They've been training for a couple of months north of the line. And they're now not confronting Australians. They're confronting these Third Corps divisions, the 18th Division, the 12th and the 58th. And they attack these trenches, and 2 days before the battle at Amiens, at the 8th of August, on the 6th, and they drive the Third Corps back about 500 or 600 metres. So the 18th Division and the 58th Division are now a long way behind their starting line. The plans don't change, so they then have to get back to the starting line. They fight for the next day. The 18th Division fights very hard through the 7th of August. And when the time for the attack comes, the 18th are pretty exhausted. They've already been fighting in the spring offensives. Let's not forget that. They were part of 5th Army, and so the 35th Brigade from 12th Division, or 36th Brigade, I'm sorry, is brought in right at the last minute to go in and do a job with the 18th Division under 18th Division command. This is messy stuff, and the tanks that they are given to use, not nearly as many as the Australians, are operating across really difficult territory. The whole artillery plan has to be rearranged a day and a half before the attack. And so the Third Corps are up against it from the start. They're fighting much more difficult opposition. The Württembergers, they're fighting, who are ready for an attack, I must say as well. They're prepared. They're not prepared over on the south of the Somme. They're really expecting a counterattack on the north. And so it goes. Now that's a little vignette, but it shows that the Third Corps had real difficulties presented to them, in part, in that case, by the Australians. What we don't see then is on the 9th, the 10th and the 11th and 12th of August, the Third Corps do really well. The Australians are struggling at that same time. The 18th Division, who are part of the Third Corps, they're a really good division. They're commanded by Ivor Maxey to begin with, and then Richard Lee. They've only got 2 commanders through the war, both really good commanders. Their battle at Albert, which is not part of our story, they capture Albert, of real significance to the British, as you can imagine, after 1916. It is comparable to, I would suggest, to the capture of Peronne. We can talk about Mons and Quentin, which of course was significant. While Mons and Quentin is being fought, I'm not in any way decrying the efforts there, extraordinary efforts. Third Corps are attacking to the north, and they are capturing Saint-Pierre-Vaste Wood. They're fighting their way north, and that in fact is isolating Mons and Quentin. Now the Australians capture it, I'm not suggesting otherwise, but it does force it helps 3rd Division up at north of Mons and Quentin to take Boucherville. 3rd Division is struggling a little bit there actually. We don't like to say that, but they are. We forget the 3rd Division are involved at that point. But the actions of 3rd Corps materially assist what happens on the Australian front. The terrain the 3rd Corps are fighting over is generally more difficult, not always. They don't have as many captures. They don't capture as many towns. Monash, of course, ticks all those boxes about numbers of prisoners and whatnot. A third of the prisoners captured by the Australians are captured on the first day, on the 8th of August. 8,000 of their prisoners are taken on that one day. By the end of it, the Australians are exhausted. I won't go through the story of the disciplinary issues and whatnot, but they really are struggling and they are breaking down. Third Corps divisions, of course, they head off and continue to fight. Now, a couple of very quick things to finish. One, there are similarities everywhere. The Australians plug into the British system on just about every level, training and all the rest, we know that. The Australians are older. Average age about 27, I think. 23 for the Third Corps, according to my numbers. Same size, 5'7". There we go, little guys, 5'6.9". It's about the average height of an Australian. And I think the British, from what I found a good document that suggests that was the same, for the Australians, same for the British. 10 stone they were when they enlisted, a lot less by the time they were fighting in 1918, I think 140 pounds, not very tall. But not very heavy. The Australians also lost 380 men per day during the advance, and they lost, 400 men per day during the advance, about 350 per kilometre of the advance. So I just wanted to put in a little plug for the British. And this ties neatly into the imperial story, I think. It's a fascinating story, and it's not told because it's lost in that massive British narrative. We carve out the Australians, of course, and treat them as a hermetically sealed unit. They're not.
Thanks, Richard.